This presentation that you're about to see, I was in the Sons of Confederate Veterans for a number of years, and this presentation I wrote some years ago and presented it to those groups, and I have updated it with a PowerPoint presentation. So without further ado, we'll get started. What you're looking at is a picture of the NC and St. L, or the Nashville and Chattanooga train station that was basically about where 13th and Broad is now. If you stood in Nashville Electric Services parking lot and looked down, you would see where the building was. In the upper right-hand corner, you could see just a glimpse of the state capitol up on top of the hill right there. There were about 6 or 7 of these photographs put together. There were about 6 or 7 of these photographs made, and this one, a guy named J.R. Harmon colorized. It took him about 20 or 30 hours to colorize this thing, and I've not seen anything like it. You'll see this one in black and white a little bit later, but this is what he did. The railroads of the Confederacy are among its finest assets. The Confederacy possessed the railroads once it was, the Confederacy possessed in its railroads its greatest advantage: interior communication lines. Carried over these lines were the machinery, the troops, the food, and the personnel that the South would use to wage war. The railroads were the shoestrings that kept the South tied together. But when you're waging war, the South had one major problem. If you look at this map, most of the rivers in the western part of the Confederacy do not run in a north-south direction. Do run in a north-south direction and not an east-west. And if you're going to wage war in the South, you need rivers to run the way you want to move your troops. And unfortunately, in the South, in the Western Division, or western part of the South, the rivers ran north and south, which was much conducive to the Yankees and not to the South. Additionally, when the South decided to secede, most of the steamboats that were used in the South were owned by Northern assets, and they, afraid that they would lose their assets, came down here and pulled their riverboats out of the Confederate reach. These factors combined to curtail severely the use of the Confederacy's waterways for tactical purposes, and the only thing that was left to do was use their roads and their railroads. Now, the roads in the 1850s in the South were mostly mechanized roads, and they weren't very good, so that really left the railroads. When the war started, the North and the South did not have proportionally the same amount of railroad mileage. Obviously, this North had more, and as the war progressed, this even got worse. And around 1840, the South possessed about 44% of all the railroads mileage in the country. As the war progressed, the North overbuilt the South, and by the time we get in the middle of the war, the South is down to only about 26% of the amount of railroad mileage that was in use in North America. The North kept building. It's once said that the North fought the war with one hand tied behind them. I mean, you realize that while the war was going on, the North even built the Transcontinental Railroad. So there was quite a bit of economic advantage in the North, and quite a bit of other advantages as well. The only thing that we had in the South was some light industry. There was before the war, nearly all the rail that had been built and all the metal that was brought in to build the locomotives and the cars had been brought in from either Britain or from the North. The only two places that we had any facilities to build railroads or build tracks or any other equipment in the South were in Richmond, Virginia. And this place I'm sorry, the first one was Richmond, which was the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, Virginia, and the other one was Etowah a light industry factory in Etowah, Georgia. down near Cartersville. As the war progressed, we lost both of those. We're going to lose both of those places, and consequently, we're going to be it's going to be a detriment to the South trying to build railroad tracks or anything else without any light industry. For decades before the 1860s, American railroads were an uncoordinated tangle of short lines, some as small as 50 miles long. In the first years of the war, there were more than 113 railroad companies operating just over 9,000 miles of track in 3 gauges. This was another detriment to the South because you had 3 different kinds of gauges. If you could take your supplies so far, but then you had to unload it, put it on another boxcar in a different gauge, and keep it moving along. Most of the railroads in the South had been built by private industry, and they did not coordinate between the companies to have a standardized gauge, which was another detriment to the South. The lines in the 1860 South were, with a few exceptions, were lightweight and haphazardly constructed. Cross ties were cut from local materials like pine, gum, or oak. Rail would not be made out of steel until 1900. The T-rails of the 1800s were wrought iron weighing less than 35 to 68 pounds. The standard railroad gauge, the standard railroad out there now is about 130-pound rail, so it's very lightweight in comparison to what we use today. This is an illustration I got out of an old railroad book on the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis Railway. You'll see that in the first illustration, this is the rail that we have now. Back then, and this book was written in the 1950s, rail was about 110 pounds. It's now up to about 130, 140 pounds. But this is what we were using during the war, was a small, what I call an inverted U rail. It was very lightweight, probably 30 or 35 pounds at best. It was gauged to only let you run at about 25 or 30 miles an hour. It was very, very lightweight, very inefficient. Even before that, before we had the strap rail, the first rails in America were before we had the U-rails, were strap rails. This is an illustration of a piece of strap rail. It was just basically what one would think of as a railroad tie with a piece of steel, a piece of iron strapped down on top of it. This is what we had started out in the 1830s, building railroads out of in this country. You could only probably get no more than about 10 or 15 miles an hour on this stuff. And in actuality, after the war was over, the N&C Railroad still had about 30 miles of track still made out of this stuff in the 1860s. Railroads, the railroad engines of this era would look like this one that you're seeing here. This is called a 440 or an American type of locomotive. Most of these engines were similar in appearance, but they had been made like the railroads companies. They had been made by different companies, and so it wasn't like trying to take a T-model Ford that had been produced on a production line. You couldn't just take the parts off of one locomotive and interchange it with another. So if one of these engines got damaged, you just couldn't go find another scrap one and take the parts off of it and interchange it with this locomotive. So if one of these locomotives got damaged, it was probably damaged for good. These were, pardon?
What's a 440?
The 440 would stand for this. You had four wheels on the front over the pilot. You had 4 back here over the cab and holding up the boiler. Sometimes you had a different wheel arrangement. There may have been more wheels back on the trailing points back here. But this was basically what we had during the war. It was a 440. This is a small, powerless little engine. This thing would probably only pull about 10 or 12 cars on a level ground. It wasn't very efficient. You're looking now at some of the freight cars of the era. Freight cars consisted of box cars called house cars. Some of them were flat cars called platform cars, and of gondolas. Coal was carried in a car that looked something similar to this one here. The modern gondola car was not an invention yet, so most of the coal was carried in a gondola car or something that looked like the color picture that you're seeing here. Before the war, there was no real reason to build a stock car. The war would change this, during the war you had the invention of what we call the livestock car today, because we were carrying cavalry and horses to pull the guns with. So they used a car something similar to the box cars in the upper left there to carry their horses in. Some of the men had to be carried around those things too after the horses, and I don't think that was a very pleasant thing to do. The caboose, usually called the conductor's car, was a local vintage passenger cars. Fleets consisted of baggage, express, and mail cars for parcels and coaches for passengers. The sleeping car was not common in use anywhere in the country and was all but non-existent in the South. Passenger cars were generally separated into first and second class. The second class were usually reserved for the slaves or the freed Negroes. We did have a need for a specialized car during the war. Of course, the first casualties were probably taken out by wagon train, but then they were taken to some destined point where they would be loaded onto what was called a hospital train. This is a photograph of a hospital train that I got somewhere. Generally, the train was painted all white, and the smokestack, the big balloon smokestack up there, was painted red to designate it as being something that the opponent should not be trying to fire on. So we did have hospital trains during the war. Both sides would develop a mortar car. They would put one of these big mortar guns on a flat car. Both sides built their own, and both sides did use these mortar cars during the war at some point. Other designated specialty cars were an armored plated car. You could see the barrel of a cannon coming out of the end of this one here. This was a thinly sheeted iron-plated car that was used for protection of that gun that was on that railroad. Not sure how you would aim this thing. It looks like if you're pointing in one direction, that's about as much as you get out of it. The bottom photograph is an actual photograph of a Nashville and Chattanooga car that was used during the war. It was used to carry ammunition in. It was iron plated as well, so that if it got hit by a missile, it would not blow up. This car was scrapped around. They used this car until about 1930 on the Nashville and Chattanooga Railway before it was finally scrapped. Railroading was dangerous work, but today's standards, the equipment was primitive. The engines were not equipped with low water alarms. This made it possible for boiler explosions to be highly possible. Only the locomotives had train brakes. Today's modern trains have brakes on the engine and an air hose that hooks all the cars together so the engineer can stop all the cars by brake. During the 1860s, you would have had only brakes on the locomotive to hold back all the other cars behind it. Air brakes that allowed the braking of every car would be a 20th century invention. The railroad man was a hardworking man. Most dangerous part of the job may have been connecting the link and pin couplers between the two cars. This made coupling to make a coupling, a trainman would usually stand between the moving cars and set a link ring into a pocket on the other car. This was done as the train was backing up slowly. He would take this pin, put it in that hole, and then drop that pin down through that link and into that hole, and then drop that pin down in it. A lot of times, this is what would have occurred. A man would have been crushed between the cars and lose a leg, an arm, or even his life. So it was a very dangerous situation. Of course, now we have what we call the glad halves, where the cars will automatically couple themselves together. As hard and dangerous as the work was for a railroad, there were very good reasons for becoming a railroad man during the war between the states. Railroad employees were exempt from military draft in many cases. The Confederate Act of 1862 provided that for the deferment of employees on the railroads. These deferments were an option of the state, the Department, Secretary of War. As late as 1862, draft officials in Georgia disregarded the act. Georgia Governor Brown immediately ordered that all railroad men in the state owned Western Atlantic Railroad into the state militia and promptly sent them back to work at the throttles when the Confederacy drafted the men away from the railroad. The Confederate Congress failed to see the attitude, see in this attitude a control over the railroad companies which would come back to haunt them. Given this lack of control, the rail companies grew to an unconscionable monsters. When the government tried to gain military control of the railroads, the companies cried foul all the way to Jeff Davis's door. When the Atlantic and Western Atlantic Railroad refused to forward certain ordinances from Atlanta, General Bragg informed the railroad superintendent that he disregarded the failure to move these ordinances on the grounds of seizure. And Superintendent Rowland immediately ran to the governor of Georgia. Governor Brown told Rowland that if Bragg seized the railroad, Rowland was to remove any officers, conductors, engineers, and agents of the railroad until Bragg's superiors were taught their duty. So you had states' rights taking control of the Confederacy, which of course is what we founded on anyway, was states' rights, and so it was an ongoing nagging problem for these private railroad companies in the states of Georgia, states of the Confederacy who had control of these railroads. They'd do what they wanted to do, and the Confederacy be darned. The railroads used the war to do some, the railroads also used the wartime to do some profiteering. Kickbacks and payoffs from both the private and military sectors became a standard way of operation. Everyone from the president of the railroad down to the switchman on the train seemed to have an outstretched palm. Though the work on the railroad was long, dirty, and dangerous for a time, the companies paid their employees a moderate salary. To hold down on some of their high operation costs, some railroad lines held Negroes as chattel. Before emancipation, the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad had expended no less than $128 million in the purchase of hands. Far from more common was the practice of leasing blacks from their owners. Although these slaves generally filled the hard medial tasks, such as positions, they also held positions of skill and responsibility. What you're looking at is an article that ran in a lot of the southern newspapers when the president of the NC, the Nashville and Chattanooga Railway, sent ads out trying to recruit these slave owners to lease their chattel to the railroad for purposes of building the railroad. This particular ad had to do with the building of the tunnel above Cumberland Mountain, in Cumberland Mountain above Cowan, Tennessee. And it's a little hard to read this, but what it also said was that they're going to be using black powder up there to blow a hole through that mountain, but they assured the slave owners that they would not use their chattel for those purposes, because these people would never let their slaves out to be used to handle dynamite, because they were afraid they would blow them up. Most of the hands that were down in Cowan that blew a hole through the mountain were Irishmen that were qualified to use the dynamite. They worked as firemen, they worked as brakemen, and many other and ran many complicated construction pieces of equipment. They filled jobs at freight houses doing much of the same type of work that their brethren along the river levees would have done, though somehow they never established themselves quite so much in legend. One only has to look at the map of the South in '61 to see the importance the railroad would play during the war. Here are some illustrations of some of the actual train stations that were along the Nashville and Chattanooga Railway during the time. This is Atlanta, Georgia, if you remember the scene from Gone with the Wind when the camera pulls back and all the Confederates are laying right beside the station. They were in this area right here. This station will stand until 1864 when General Sherman and some of his boys got a little slap happy with matches down there and burnt the thing to the ground. So, but this is a general view of Atlanta, Georgia. This is the train station at Stevenson, Alabama. The southern, the Charleston and Western Railroad, which will later become the Southern Railroad, is down here. I'm sorry, is up there, and this is the Nashville and Chattanooga. They both converged there in Stevenson, Alabama. From the opening fire in 1861, when Stonewall Jackson moved his advanced troops the last 35 miles to Manassas Junction by rail, to the rickety cars that ferried the last dwindling supplies to Marshall Robert and Appomattox, the railroads were a most important element in the war. Campaign strategy often based their ability on the capacity of the railroad line. The construction, maintenance, and defense of these lines was vital. These vital links involved large numbers of men and deployment of such equipment. Many armies held particular locations because of the proximity of the railroad. Major battles were fought at locations where one army was encamped protecting the line. Murfreesboro was such an example. Located on the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad, the Confederate attacks the entrenched Federals to gain power, gain control of the line going between Nashville and Bridgeport, Alabama. Nashville, by this time, was a major depot because of the proximity of the rails, and the rivers Shiloh and Corinth, Mississippi were also on the main line of the Memphis and Charleston Railroad, and most important east-west route. The entire Chattanooga and Atlanta campaign was fought over the railroad supplies to Atlanta and into the Deep South. Sherman said in his memoirs that the Atlanta campaign would never have been possible but for the single track line that was running the 473 miles between these two towns, which carried this railroad carried supplies for over 100,000 men and 35,000 animals for 196 days, while Sherman was retreating out of Nashville to Tullahoma down to Chattanooga, down through North Alabama and north of Georgia, and then into Atlanta. The South lost control of its, when the South lost control of its rail system, it was probably one of the most devastating and crippling blows. With each loss of the rail line, it became harder and harder for the South to bring the war to its enemy. Not only did the railroads transport much of the supplies and material, but they also played an important part in the maneuvers by which the Confederates switched their often outnumbered troops from one theater to another. In one such case, General Longstreet moved over 18,000 much-needed troops over 7 states, 7 different railroads from the Army of Virginia down to Georgia. These troops arrived just in time to reinforce Bragg at the second day of the Battle of Chickamauga and to turn it into a Confederate victory. This is the car barns in Chattanooga. This was the second such movement in the mass Confederate troops in just as few months. In the midsummer, Bragg himself made a daring movement of 35,000 troops across 4 states to reach Chattanooga. He raced the advancing Buell to beat him into the city. This movement by Bragg was the first important strategic use of a national railroad system, and it caught Buell off guard. After Bragg reached Chattanooga, he burned the bridges of the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad at Bridgetown, Alabama, keeping the Buell from crossing the river and delaying the Federal entrance into the town of Chattanooga. 3 railroads ran at this same time. 3 railroads were running out of Nashville. The Nashville and Chattanooga was running east to Chattanooga. The unfinished Central Georgia which would later become the National Decatur Railroad, was running south to Stevenson, through Columbia down to the Alabama line. And the Nashville and Louisville and Nashville was running southeast towards Stevenson, out of Alabama, out of Columbia, Tennessee as well. They paid an astronomical fees for any type of let me say, the next thing that happened would be Nashville would be the first major city in the South to fall. With the fall of Fort Donelson and Fort McHenry, Nashville was abandoned by the Confederacy. It must have been quite chaotic here in Nashville trying to get out of town. Everybody was trying to get out. In fact, the Yankees were standing in the high grounds above Nashville looking down and seeing all these people trying to get out of town. They mistook it for Confederate troops moving into town to reinforce Nashville, and did not come into Nashville, even though Nashville had been abandoned, did not come into this town for 3 days, thinking it was Confederates moving in when it was people moving out. The picture you're looking at is of Vernon Kay Stevenson. Vernon Kay Stevenson was a Nashville businessman. He was also the first president and the founder of the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad. He was also at the time the quartermaster of the Confederate Army in Nashville, Tennessee. At the time that Nashville is to fall, everybody, as I said, was trying to get the heck out of Georgia, literally and figuratively. Vernon Kay Stevenson took a Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad's train and backed it up to that train station that I showed you in one of the first pictures down here, and he loaded his horses, his carriage, his good furniture, his wife, his slaves, and this train was pointing south. And when he got the heck out of Georgia, he abandoned the quartermaster's job as the Confederacy and got the heck out of Georgia. I love the man for starting the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad, but I don't particularly care for what he did during the war. But he took the records from the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad and the Nashville and Northwestern Railroad, which is the railroad from New Johnsonville, Tennessee, over to McKenzie and up to Hickman, Kentucky. He took those railroad records with him and went down to Augusta, Georgia, and still profited it down there. And actually, the Confederacy, in its ignorances, made him the quartermaster down in Georgia when he got down there. I don't know exactly why they did that. The Nashville storehouse doors were finally thrown open to the public with the abandonment of Vernon Stevenson leaving his job as quartermaster. The storehouse was pilfered, and much of the supplies that did not get taken by the public on the start with was thrown in the Cumberland River. Nathan Bedford Forrest rode into town to save the day, as he did many other times during the war. He distributed what food he could get, carried away what food he couldn't, and threw the rest of it in the Cumberland River out here. So a lot of ammunition, a lot of food, a lot of material that the South could have used to fight the war was thrown in the Cumberland River out here. Within months, the defeats at Shiloh and Corinth, Mississippi dealt another devastating blow to the Confederacy. Not only did the South lose thousands of its finest men on the fields of Shiloh, but when Corinth fell, along with it one of the most vital railroad hubs in the West. The devastating Battle of Shiloh occurred away from the railroad only because Albert Sidney Johnson chose to strike Grant at Shiloh before he could make the link up with Buell. If you recall, the Yankees were stationed just above Corinth, Mississippi, on the Tennessee side of the Tennessee River, and the attack took on there when the Confederacy decided to attack Buell before he could be reinforced. This is the picture I showed you earlier in the day. This is a black and white copy of this photograph. These are United States military railroad engines. After the South lost Nashville and the Yankees took over, they made this a supply hub, as the Confederates had done before, to supply all these, to take all these supplies away from these storehouses that were built all around this area down here. The Yankees built railroad locomotives up north and brought them down here. And so what you're seeing, these all engines that had been in Tennessee had by this time been evacuated south to keep them from falling into to Yankee hands. And so the North is building new locomotives, apparently doing quite well at it, as you can see the number of locomotives that are here. And this is a picture of the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad station here in Nashville after the Yankees turned this into the Mississippi Division of the United States Military Railroad. This photograph, the photograph you saw a while ago would have been looking this way, and this is turned a little bit to the east rather from the other photograph. This building here was built by the Yankees during the war. This building was here originally by the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad. This is an interesting car. This was a self-propelled locomotive and box car. It had its own motor power. Quite an interesting shot. As I told the gentleman back here a while ago, there were about 6 or 7 photographs made at the same time. Most of the time you see the one that I showed you just a minute ago, and sometimes you see this one, but there was he actually turned the camera this way and then went back toward the present day Union Station and made 4 or 5 other photographs. So if you research, you can find those other 5 or 6 photographs. But the railroads were important for one other reason, and that was because, of course, they were used to supply the supplies up and down the line, but also they were very vulnerable. And so, if you had men, if you were trying to protect the railroad, you had to take men out of military use or out of battle use for protection of running protecting the railroads. During the war, because Nashville had fallen so early, a lot of the runaway slaves had come into Nashville and were just laying around town on the public dole. So they took a lot of these, what they call contraband, these runaway slaves that were just hanging around Nashville on the public dole, and put them to work building the railroad. So they built from the end there in Kingston Springs down to Johnsonville. They got these freed blacks and runaway slaves to build the railroad between those 2 points, and then the North had a supply line. They could bring the supplies down to Johnsonville, offload it onto the trains, and take the train from Johnsonville into Nashville and supply the supply line here in Nashville. But you also had to guard those railroads, and so after the railroads were built by these runaway slaves or chattel or whatever they were, they also turned around and hired these black workmen and made them Union colored troops, and turned them right around and let them guard the same railroad they had already built. The joke is that when they were working on the railroad, they paid them $20 a month to build the railroad, and after they put them in the Army, they paid them $10 a month to do the same, to be the same thing. But this is the bridge in Nashville. If you go down and look at the Cumberland River Bridge, the Turn Bridge, this is where this one's set. You can see the guard towers up here where they were used for gun turrets to protect that bridge down there. This is a reroute in one of down in North Alabama, but I know where there's one pretty close to here in Tennessee as well. And these were used just usually at some place where there was a trestle or somewhere like that to guard those positions. Of course, a lot of the railroads were torn up during the war. When the South had the possession of the railroad, the North would try to tear it up. When the South lost that railroad and the Yankees took over, the South would turn around and do the same thing. So there was an awful lot of destruction during the war. The best way to disable a piece of machinery was to put a cannonball through a locomotive like that. But there were other ways of destroying things too. A pipe bomb was developed by a man named Houck, who was a Yankee railroad man who needed to teach his people how to destroy a railroad. So they developed a little pipe bomb that they could carry around in a backpack of a saddle and tear up the railroad track with it. Everybody's probably familiar with what they called the Sherman's hairpin, neckties or hairpins. What you're looking at is a piece of bent rail. They would literally rip the rail up, take it and put it on a bonfire, heat the center of it, and then 5 or 6, 7 men would pick the rail up and run it at a good oak tree or something and wrap that thing around it like that. And so you got this hairpin effect out of the rail. After a while, they found out that this was not the most effective way to tear up a piece of railroad track, that the Confederates could actually heat that rail back up. And with a little manpower and a few sledgehammers, they could literally beat that thing back close enough. Remember, it's iron, it's not steel, so it'll bend. And they would straighten the things back out. So Halp got real industrious, and he said, I know how to do this where you can't fix it. And so they would literally take this bar and put it on the rail. There's the man over here doing the same thing. One of them pulled this way, one of them pulled that way, and they put a radial twist in the rail, making it look kind of like a candy cane. You can't straighten this out. You can't put that back you can't put that on a fire and turn it back. You had to go to a rolling mill to fix that, and of course the South didn't have any rolling mills at that time. President Jefferson wrote that the Confederacy died of a theory. One major problem in the South was that the government had a doctrine of states' rights that by the 1860s had been well ingrained in the Southern mind. Men were confusing it with multiple other rights, including regional, municipal, and even personal. No organization could appeal more logically to states' rights than the Southern Railroad companies. An example of the policies run asunder was that when McClellan's army was besieging Richmond, Virginia, rows of cars that were not seized for military purposes by the Confederacy, but were stood idle just outside of Atlanta because they had been designated to a local flour company to deliver the flour for the mill. And so the South, as I alluded to earlier, did not have control over the railroads. As late as about late 1864, Congress finally stepped in, the Confederacy Congress finally stepped in, tried to remedy this, but by that time it was way too late. These are just some general photographs of wartime scenes. That's Chattanooga again. Those are some Confederate prisoners. These are some just railroad workers working on the railroad during the war. I draw my final thoughts from the Railroads of the Confederacy by John C. Black, from whose book I took most of my research. Mr. Black sums up in his book in this manner: railroads formed the backbones through not only the whole structure of Southern apparatus of supply and communications, but they were also done in a continental phase of every American war since then. They afforded the principal Confederate advantage of interior lines. While most of these lines remained intact, the Southern front might give way, but they never suffered a general collapse. Yet the South did not win the war. The wars of the Confederacy suffered from several defeats, but it all played out in the end. In general, there were several things deficits that cost the war for the South, as far as railroads concerned. There were never enough railroads in the South, and they were not always in the right place for her to use them strategically. There were too many gaps that should have been have continuous lines. If you recall, I said that the gauges were all different and so on and so forth. This included the difference in the gauges. The Southern ability to manufacture railroad supplies and rolling stock was way too low. We only had the two places at Tredegar and the one in Etowah to reconstruct any damages to the railroad equipment or the rails that we needed. With the integral shortage of rolling stock and the increasingly efficiency of the railroad federal blockades, this was an extremely serious, if not fatal, matter. However, the men were not at fault when war is lost. It was not the locomotives and the cars or even the economic geography. In addition, as far as the railroad logics were concerned, the Confederates committed two major sins. Railroad owners, managers, and even the employees were unwilling to make serious sacrifices from their personal interest, and the Confederate government was both loath to enforce the kind of transportation policies the war efforts would demand. Therefore, in the end, states' rights that had been such a primary factor in the South succeeding played a key part in keeping the Confederate Congress from holding on to the most precious assets, its railroads. In addition, with the loss of these railroads, the South could not hold on against the invasion in its heartland. Do I have any questions, gentlemen?
Talking about the two different gauges.
There were at least 3 different gauges, 113 different kinds of, 113 different railroad companies had some mileage in the South.
We had in Nashville, we had an important line going north to Louisville, and an important line going southeast. Were they the same gauge?
They were the same gauge. They were used on 5'2" gauge at the time.
What about the one going west to New John?
I'm not sure about what the Western Atlantic was using, the National and Northwestern was using, but I would think that they were using the same gauge. Now, the National and Chattanooga would later take control of the National and Northwestern, so I think they were using the same gauge, but I'm not positive.
Were the other gauges just like in the mountains in East Tennessee?
Yeah, you have to remember that my talk here was about railroads in general, and so this encompassed everything from Tennessee, Mississippi, and Alabama all the way over to Maryland and Virginia. So if you get that far as 11 or 12 states in the Confederacy, you had that many different railroad gauges across the entire South.
There weren't any lines running to Texas from the Atlanta, say. How did the Texas troops get to Virginia in the early 1860s?
I don't know. I've never.
They brought their cavalry. How did they get it?
I guess they did it on foot.
Well, they had to cross the Mississippi River. I guess they did that on a ferry.
Right. The South is going to try to build in fact, the South was trying to build a transcontinental railroad before the war, and it became. In the federal Congress, before we seceded, the Congress was debating as to where to put the Continental Railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad. Of course, with the secession in 1861, the point became quite moot, and it started, in Missouri and goes to California through Omaha, Nebraska, and so on and so forth. But there was, and it's not going to be until 1870 till the South takes up that debate again, and it wasn't until then. In fact, the railroad between here and Lebanon, Tennessee, that will become the Tennessee Central, was built for that purpose. It was called the Tennyson Pacific Railroad, although they built from Nashville to Lebanon instead of from going west. I don't know how you go to the Pacific Railroad, Pacific Ocean going east. But they built. The idea was to build from Knoxville, Tennessee through Nashville to Memphis, go down to Mississippi, from Mississippi go over to El Paso, Texas. And in El Paso, Texas, they were going to connect with railroad that would be started there and would go to the West Coast. So
30 miles out of the built.
They got 30 miles out of the built. That's what they did. And then there's a little small section that was down in Lexington, Tennessee, going back west that way too. They actually built 2 pieces of the Tennyson Pacific after the war.
I've always wondered how those Texas troops got to Manassas, for instance.
That's a good question. And that was a long haul without a railroad to hold you. Yeah, long haul.
Another question. After the Battle of Nashville, what was left of Hood's army retreated down to the Tennessee River to either Florence or Corinth. And that army, what was left of it, ended up in North Carolina to surrender. How'd they get them there? How'd they get them from, say, Corinth to Florence all the way to North Carolina?
Well, we couldn't use the Yankee-controlled railroad from Corinth over.
They went south to Mobile.
Yeah, they must have, because the Yankees had control of the Charleston, Memphis and Charleston Railroad, which was running that way. Right. I don't think they cordially let the Confederacy use those railroads to get across like that.
I know that's what I said is true about them getting that, because my great grandfather was in the Confederate soldiers in Hood's army, and he ended up surrendering in North Carolina. So they got somewhere that way somewhere. They sure didn't march all that distance in 2 or 3 months. As depleted as they were, out of the poor boys had lost everything here at Nashville.
Yeah, barefooted and tromping through.
Didn't have shoes. Didn't have shoes. Didn't have anything. Wintertime.
Do you know anything about? There's a bridge across the Tennessee River at a place called Rainwater Creek. And when the Confederates retreated, they destroyed it. And there's pictures I found on the internet in the Library of Congress of the rebuilt bridge.
Right.
It is an unbelievable structure.
Yeah.
They must have cut down every tree, in that part of Tennessee, and I would not have gotten on that bridge if you paid me.
Yeah.
But do you know anything about about them rebuilding that bridge and how they did it?
It was rebuilt in about 30 days, or about a month's time. They rebuilt that whole thing down there. The bridge he's talking about is that big tall one. If you go from here to Chattanooga, you go under that high railroad bridge down just after you've crossed over Mount Eagle and go down the mountain and you cross under that railroad bridge. That's where he was talking about. That's Running Creek there. And I don't know for sure how that was rebuilt. Somewhere I read that they rebuilt that thing in a little less than a month.
It's the most unbelievable picture. It looks like a roller coaster way up in the sky.
Oh yeah, it's just big old tall timbers lashed together and trying to. I'm with you. I don't think I want to ride any kind of contraption across that thing. Yes.
What was the typical speed of the trains back then?
The typical train, because the track was so bad, and if you recall the shot I showed you about of the slaves laying the track and refurbishing the track in Murfreesboro, that photograph was made just after the battle down there in December of '62. They would put down a tie and tack the rails lightly to it, but there was never any ballast between there. Ballast didn't come along for a long time after that, so the tracks would wash out again, and it was rickety and I'm sure about as crooked as a snake's back. And it was just, the remarkable thing, if you recall the story of the Great Locomotive Chase, they got up to 55 and 60 miles an hour, and you've got to remember one of those engines was running backward. The Texas was running backwards at 55 miles an hour trying to chase down the General. You talking about going across that bridge, how rickety, that trestle, how rickety it was. Can you imagine doing 65 miles or 60 miles an hour backwards on the Texas trying to catch the General down there? That had to have been a heck of a ride. Yes.
As a neophyte of railroads here, this might be a very common thing, but I don't know it. You were talking, there were so many size tracks during that time, what, 113 you said?
That was 113 companies, but there were about 3 different gauges.
Now, through the years, when did those consolidate, and like how many gauges are there today? I know there's
just one. I'm sorry, you're right. There was narrow gauge, which you used during mountain terrains because it doesn't take up as much room to put a track in. But they actually, 2 times in American history, on one day, on one weekend actually it was, they standardized all the track gauge in America on one weekend. They started on a Friday night and picked that one rail up and moved it in. Of course, I'm sure there was some kind of pressure, but they did it all in 2 days. I don't understand what the rush was, but they actually picked that rail up and moved it over and standardized it to 4 foot 8 inches.
What year was that?
1860. 78. I'm sorry, it's in my book, but I can't recall exactly. But it was all done on one weekend, and then they did it another weekend, but they standardized all the rail gauges in America on 2 different weekends. A lot of it was here in Tennessee, in fact.
NC and St. L had the train that ran from Columbia to Fayetteville, and it started out as the Duck River and Marigate.
That's right.
And it ran through where I grew up, and they tore up the Columbia to Lewisburg leg, but they left the Lewisburg to Fayetteville leg, and it ran until sometime in the 1970s.
Right.
So I rode the last train to Fayetteville.
Yeah, it's in my book. 5 years to research the thing, and I can't remember everything that I've researched. And so I keep a copy of my book close to because I'm always going back and researching my own book, trying to find something that I need to, for. It's my reference book as well as anybody else's. So. But the thing about changing the gauges in there and how we inherited each of those railroad lines.
What's the process? I always wondered what the process was when they tore that track up between Lewisburg and Fayetteville. What's typically the process when the right-of-way is abandoned? How do they deal with the ownership of the land?
That I don't know either.
Obviously, the railroad owned it at some point.
They sold it to adjacent
So do they sell it?
farmers, yeah. There's still some of that old right-of-way obvious down around south of Franklin that I found, and some of it was until they put track on it up around between Allgood and Monterey. But I guess the railroad held on to that land up there because they put track back. But the land down there between, say, Fly, Tennessee, and south of that is still
And a lot of times it was converted into a state highway too. That line he's talking about is that road that goes down through Fly is now a state highway, but that was the right of way for the Middle Tennessee Railroad.
There's some of it's a highway, right?
Yeah, and there's
off the side you can find pieces of that embankment.
Right.
Douglas Henry and I have done it.
Yeah, before they finished the Natchez Trace Railroad, you could see all kinds of right of way down through there. Of course, it was taken.
I understand that 440, the right of way for 440 follows a good bit of the old Tennessee.
Oh yeah, that's exactly where it was. The Nashville and Chattanooga and the L&N would not let Jerry Baxter play with them at Union Station over here, so he had to, and in fact, if you go look, the railroad track goes up to where the N&E stops for their commuter train. Used to go up the top of the hill up there behind the Wild Horse, up to the top of the hill to Fort Negley, and stopped up there. And then the railroad picked up right behind the old police headquarters. So the Tennessee Central liked about 600 yards connecting itself, but the L&N and the NC kept him from connecting its own railroad. So he had to build a 4.5 mile track around from Lebanon Road out there just south of the Tennessee Central Railway Museum, around past the fairgrounds and out to Melrose and on around, crossing West End out there, and at West End and Murphy Road, and then went on around and finally got back to itself again. But he had to build a 4.5 mile round, and that's where, of course, that's where 440 is now. Yeah. Yes.
What did you say about the Nashville and Decatur Railroad? You said they moved the railroad, moved something up here to form the Nashville and Decatur.
Originally, the Nashville and Decatur came all the way into town and stopped at 5th and Broad, where the Bridgestone Arena is now. That depot was then moved south to 4th and Chestnut, where the old Nashville cotton mill was, and it stood there until about the 1980s when it got burned and some other things, and they finally tore the thing down. But if you were here earlier, the L&N came into Nashville in 1859, 9 years after the NC had already been here, and they came across the drawbridge over here and came over between 2nd and 3rd Avenue over there behind Channel 5, and that's where their station stopped. And they had a station there that that's where they're in a small yard, and that's where the L&N stopped when it came into Nashville. It didn't come around by Bicentennial Mall and hook up and go south on down to Alabama like it does now. But the L&N bought the old Nashville and Decatur Railroad, and so they had a piece over here coming in through Englewood, or through Edgefield rather, and had that piece out there, but they didn't have a connection, so they used the Nashville and Chattanooga railroad track to ferry between the two points, and they actually built that trestle around through where Bicentennial Mall is now to connect those two pieces. So for a long time, the L&N had no connection between its own, with the north part of its railroad and the south part of its railroad until they built that trestle around through there.
Is this, looking at the new ballpark and the greenway that comes along over behind the outfield, it looks like from some old maps that greenway was originally a railroad.
How far up is that?
It's behind the stockyard.
Yeah, the original Louisville and Nashville had a small yard between 2nd and 3rd, but just barely past to where the railroad track, where the railroad track is now. So I'm not sure about how far up they are. Of course, then the Tennessee Central also had a yard down there, just where the Bicentennial Mall is now, because I remember when they used to bring the circus in, they'd park all that stuff over in there. So there's a lot of railroad in Spur, and of course there was a lot of industry up in there. They used to go to Newhoff Packing Company and some other places up in that area too. So there's a lot of tracks that ran up into those industrial areas, up to some of those fruit sellers and some other places up there. So I'm not sure exactly over the years what.
I've got a map of downtown that was as late as 2002, and it showed Spur coming in behind where the ballpark is now and runs parallel to Herman Street.
Yeah.
And it goes over to the west, maybe about 6 blocks, which it's gone now.
Yeah.
If you look at a picture of old Sulphurdale, it would have run right along in front of where you used to go in the main entrance to Sulphurdale.
Right. But again, there was Newhoff Packing Company and all that other industry along that river, and they had to have spurs going up in there to deliver cars and to those industries along the rivers around there. So, and there was a railroad track all the way out there to where that concrete plant is there, where if you're on what I call the old 265, that concrete company out there still has a spur all the way out to it. So where that landfill and that concrete company is out there by the river.
What do they call that line from Nashville to Nashville City? What's the name of that line?
It's now called the Nashville. This one's a Nashville and Eastern. That's a Nashville and Western. They're owned by the same company, but they're
Nashville East and
Nashville and Eastern and Nashville and Western.
Well, they don't connect up though, do they?
They did. They don't anymore.
I thought that one to Ashland City stopped out 11th and Herman.
Well, but that was part of that 440 interchange that we were talking about a while ago. That came all the way around and came over there to Hairpins Street and all in that, where that yard was down through there. That old Tennessee Central, and then later IC Railroad engine house, you can see from 40 if you're coming around the outside loop out there past Church Street, you can still see this where they park in those locomotives. But that's their terminus now. It used to go all the way down behind Channel 5, but it doesn't go that far down anymore.
But they were able to fix the bridge across from Cumberland.
Yes.
Because at one time, that was what was holding.
One of the local councilmen wanted to tear that thing. Well, the Corps of Engineers wanted to tear that thing down because it's a hazard to the commerce of the riverboats. It does rotate. Yeah. Yeah, that would be a wonderful place to put a tourist railroad over there. I used to ride that when I was early in my police career. I used to ride on that railroad and we'd ride to Ashland City making deliveries. That's beautiful, hanging on that cliff and with the river on one side and a cliff on the other side and going around those curves and down parallel to the Ashland City Highway. It's beautiful down there. It'd make a great place to put a tourist railroad today.
Was there ever a line in that Woodlawn Cemetery we went out there the other day and there's some little cabins there that I've never seen before, and there's a plaque there, and it says something about the railroad and a child who was on the railroad almost got killed. Was there ever a line right up there on Woodlawn Cemetery somewhere?
I don't know.
Well, there's an overpass there at Woodlawn Cemetery. Isn't it?
Well, the Lebanon branch of the NC ran out that way.
Maybe that's what it was.
Yeah. Right there at Trimble Bottom off of Murfreesboro Road, you've got three lines came in. The Tennessee Central came around the main line of the Tennessee Central, that 440 leg, went out there, and the Nashville Chattanooga line went over the top of it, and the Nashville branch going to Lebanon on the NC went that way out. So you have three railroads could connect right there in that little corner, right there in Trimble Bottom. Thank you.